Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and don't worry guys, I'm wearing a V-neck underneath this coat. And no, I haven't joined the Empire. We're simply just collaborating with them on some scientific research. I recently came back from one of their Arctic research facilities. We were basically trying to figure out how to remove the Leku off of Twi'leks and then grow them onto Wookiees. Because, you know, science is really cool. Anyway, for Jedi, there is no before the Battle of Yavin or after the Ruusan Reformation. Everything in their history revolves around the devastating events of Order 66, one of the most efficient and swift offensives of the Jedi-Sith War. Although it didn't completely destroy the Jedi Order, Order 66 shattered the Jedi's foundation, and Palpatine's harsh policies afterwards successfully restricted the organization from ever coming back. The few attempts afterwards to restart the Jedi Order by Cal Kestis and later on Luke Skywalker were stymied by the fact that most traces of the Jedi Order had been destroyed by Emperor Palpatine's purges. Now, Palpatine made a lot of mistakes in his latter years, but even his biggest detractors will have to admit that he did an excellent job at wiping out the Jedi. But what would have happened if Order 66 had never happened? What if Palpatine died, say, during the Battle of Coruscant, executed by an overzealous Grievous, or killed during Anakin's attempt to do an emergency landing from orbit with half a cruiser? Or what if that Zillo beast had swallowed up that gunship that Chancellor Palpatine tried to escape his office with? What if Anakin didn't chop off Mace Windu's arm and instead Mace Windu chopped Palpatine in half? Things would have definitely changed for the better for the Jedi, the Republic, and the Separatists, but not necessarily for the better. Today we're going to take a look at what would have happened to the Jedi Order had Order 66 never happened. If there's one line I agree with the most in The Last Jedi, it's this one.
It's time for the Jedi to end.
In one lifetime, Luke figured out something about the Jedi that the Jedi Order for tens of thousands of years could never fully understand. This could be due to the fact that Luke's Jedi Order was drastically different from Yoda's. Yoda's Jedi Order was during the height of the Galactic Republic and the Clone Wars. Yoda had adopted a rigid system full of hierarchical structures, rules, and restrictions that had been created as a result of thousands of years of constant warfare with the Sith. The Jedi Order had grown into a massive organization by 22 BBY, and it was extremely adept at suppressing alternative thoughts that went against the Jedi orthodoxy. Luke was in a complete opposite direction. Both of his masters had faded away and turned to ghosts, and they were pretty much the only connection he had with the Old Republic and the Jedi Order, which meant that he would spend the first few decades after the Galactic Civil War ended searching for direction from whatever Jedi books and archives he could recover. Unfortunately, as we mentioned before, Palpatine was ruthlessly efficient at getting rid of every trace of the Jedi. The only artifacts left for Luke to find were either hidden within Palpatine's observatories scattered around the edges of the galaxy, or in ancient ruins dating back to around the time of the beginning of the Jedi Order. Which is exactly where we need to go to understand what Master Luke understood and also understand what would happen to the Jedi Order had Order 66 never happened. Legends say that the ancient Jedi, or Jedi as they were called, embraced both the dark side and the light side of the Force. These ancient practitioners of the Force found balance within themselves and cautiously made sure they never drifted too far to one side or another. They understood a simple truth that all Jedi seem to forget, and that was the fact that the light side and the dark side are in all of us. And the Force cannot be intrinsically evil or good. An evil person could use the Force to do terrible things, and a good person could use the Force to do wonderful things. But at the end of the day, it's not the Force that causes things to happen, but the individual wielding the Force. And then from a more practical standpoint, both sides of the Force had their own strengths and weaknesses. The dark side was perfect for aggression and combat, while the light side was great for healing and diplomacy. To simply refuse to use one side of the Force in their daily tasks would have seemed very strange to these primitive Force users. Because the world the Jedi lived on, Tython, was still wild and dangerous. Civilization had not yet tamed the solar system, and they had enemies to fight and defeat, which usually meant large packs of bandits or wild animals. Even so, these smaller conflicts were much less time-consuming and ideological than the grand crusades the Jedi would later carry out against the Sith. Now, during this time of open-mindedness and self-accountability and restraint, the Jedi thrived. Records indicate that their understanding of the Force far surpassed anything that later generations of Jedi would learn. For instance, they had access to Force alchemy and could create living flesh that could be used to fill in gruesome wounds both physically and spiritually. Force alchemy would eventually be banned by the Jedi Order and labeled a dark art, and of course all of those practices would be lost to history. The Jedi Order were so strict that they didn't even allow their own scientists to figure out just how exactly the Force worked in the first place. The Jedi were also quite forgiving when they sensed an individual was drifting too far to one side of the Force. The planet that the Jedi lived on, Tython, had two moons, Ashla and Bogan, and they represented the harmony of the Force. Bogan was a wellspring of dark side energy, and Ashla was a wellspring of light side energy. The Jedi would take those who had gone too far to the dark side and send them into exile onto Ashla, where they would meditate and bathe in the light energy of the moon, and individuals who had gone too far to the light side would be exiled onto Bogan and bathed in the dark side energies there. The reason why they did this was because they're kind of an enlightened people. They understood that rehabilitation was a lot better than punitive measures and judgment of other individuals. They didn't shame those who went extreme or see them as morally lacking. Instead, they saw a human or a lesser alien that had fallen into a trap that any one of them could have fallen into, but especially the aliens because they're lesser. The Jedi were far less structured than the later Jedi organizations, so that meant that there were no Jedi guards or officials that would go and arrest an individual and treat them like a criminal. Oftentimes, the exiles were actually self-imposed, or interventions were staged by family members or friends who thought an individual had gone too extreme. Now, eventually the Jedi would become transforming into what later would be known as the Jedi Order. This was most likely triggered by their first contact with the Republic. The Jedi would eventually turn into the Jedi Order and drift more towards embracing just the light side of the Force and nothing else, until they outright banned any use of the dark side of the Force. Of course, this naturally made many young Jedi curious, and soon the more inquisitive members of the Order began practicing the dark side first in secret, and then fully embracing and championing its advantages to their peers, which of course was a mistake, and led to the 100 Years of Darkness, or the first Great Jedi Schism. This split was 100% the fault of the Jedi Order. By banning the dark side, they were essentially banning a very natural part of every individual's connection to the Force. It's kind of like having cable TV, which for you younglings out there is sort of like Netflix, but instead all of the actors in movies live inside of this tiny little box that the cable guy brings to your house and installs, which is kind of similar to live TV, which is where the actors in TV shows live inside of the TV. Why were we talking about cable TV? It doesn't matter. Let's just keep going. The point is, the Jedi not only banned something that was as natural to a Force user as breathing, they also specifically banned any teachings or literature on the subject matter. And as we see with most controlled things in society, like sex, drugs, alcohol, cannibalism, it is a terrible idea to forbid someone to do something without explaining them why first. So instead of being fully prepared to encounter the dark side with an older Jedi maybe mentoring them, many of these dark Jedi first encountered the dark side by themselves or with other inexperienced and stupid young Jedi. It was a recipe for disaster. Now, there's another aspect of the ancient Jedi-Sith wars that are never really talked about because the Jedi have controlled the narrative for most of the timeline, and that's the fact that the Jedi first started the war against the Sith. See, the Dark Jedi simply wanted to be left alone and practice their version of the Force, and the Jedi, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically, tried to bring them back. What resulted were a series of wars that became more and more brutal and more desperate, and also drove each side further to their extremes. The Jedi in many ways forced the Sith to become the very evil they had feared they would become. While fans of the franchise who are only familiar with the original trilogy might have this perception that the Sith were all powerful and always in charge, nothing could actually be further from the truth. The Republic and the Jedi were in control of the galaxy for like 99% of the timeline, and so the Jedi usually had the upper hand and also numbers on their side. And while they controlled the galaxy, it was hardly ever stable and full of violence, evil, and war. And oftentimes, the Jedi would be the ones getting their hands bloody. It was Jedi who led the Republic fleet that bombed Korriban into submission from orbit. It was the Jedi who went door to door executing members of the Sith species, not to be confused with the dark side users known as the Sith. Yes, this was a complete genocide. It was also a group of Jedi Masters that had massacred their own Padawans because of some Force hallucination they had. So contrary to popular belief, the Jedi were far from the paragons of goodness that they wanted you to think of them as. They were more like an extreme pseudo-religious cult, and like all extremists, they had the arrogance to assume that they had all the answers in the galaxy, and only their way was right. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Jedi had become so extreme that many of their actions were directly going against their basic teachings. They began justifying the execution of unhanded Sith captives, the kidnapping of Force-sensitive babies. They got involved in people's personal relationships and marital affairs. Had the Jedi of ancient times seen the modern-day Jedi Order, they would have seen them as a threat and also a huge perversion of what they originally set out to do. Yet somehow the Jedi maintained their moral high ground and superiority despite all of their hypocrisy. Obi-Wan Kenobi, in his showdown with Anakin, unwittingly explained just how lost the Jedi had become with this following quote.
"Only a Sith deals in absolutes."
You probably kind of get a sense of where I'm going with this. Now, what would have happened had the Jedi Order survived Order 66? What would have happened had their system never been broken? Well, for one, the Jedi and their light side doctrine was just inept at facing the realities of warfare. While policies like not attacking first and avoiding violence at all costs are great parameters to set for peacekeepers or judicials or police officers, these are not really practical rules of engagement for the traditional types of battles that the Jedi encountered. To skip out on an opportunity to ambush your enemy is also denying your own soldiers the opportunity to survive a battle. To not use every strategic advantage to your disposal for some ideological goal would make you as a commander a huge liability. Although many Jedi tried to show restraint, two things usually happened. One, they died because of that restraint, or two, they would slide down that slippery slope of becoming a full-blown warrior, something that a Mandalorian might be proud of. Less controlled Jedi went on killing sprees all the time. Even more controlled and calm Jedi like Obi-Wan Kenobi would do highly immoral things like attack an enemy general under the protection of a white flag. Actually, Anakin would do the same thing and rammed an enemy fleet with a Star Destroyer, also under the pretense that he was coming in for a parlay with the enemy commander. It's actually the most brilliant part of Palpatine's plan. He realized that he didn't really need to do anything to take down the Jedi Order. He could just put them in a situation that they weren't able to handle and they would pretty much destroy themselves. A quick look into the Jedi Order's past and you'll see that oftentimes the Jedi Order will avoid joining a conflict, but a group of usually young and hot-headed Jedi would disobey that order and then join the war. That's what happened to Revan, and he ended up going to the dark side and killing massive amounts of people on both sides. Lord Hoth also disobeyed the Jedi Order and took things into his own hand and created a Jedi army. Although he didn't go to the dark side, many of his followers did, maddened by their exposure to war and violence. The reality was that had the war continued going, the Jedi would have eventually either split apart, maybe Anakin would have started his own more militant faction like Revan and Hoth, or perhaps even more likely, the Jedi would just simply disobey what the Chancellor and the Senate would say and wage their own personal war against whoever they saw was evil in the galaxy. Many Jedi would develop combat-related injuries, both physically and spiritually. Some would ultimately turn to the dark side, either out of futility or maybe even desperation. If you're in a situation where you can either die from a Seppi battle droid firing squad or use Sith lightning to protect yourself and potentially go to the dark side, I think it's pretty obvious what most sane people would choose. The Jedi teachings can truly only survive in a controlled environment, perhaps on some secluded planet like Ahch-To, void of conflict. It was an ideology that could not withstand the grim realities of the battlefield. Look at Anakin's face after he aids Palpatine in the murder of Mace Windu. He's not only reflecting on how he's just let down one of his mentors, but he's also contemplating how the Jedi Order would react. He knew that there was no way back, no reset, which is kind of what most Jedi would have felt once they fell to the dark side. There was no forgiveness, no hearing, no rehabilitation. They were immediately labeled dangerous enemies of the Republic, individuals who carried the plague that was the dark side. Now, there were obviously some really terrible things that happened in Order 66, like the death of a lot of younglings and children who were obviously very innocent, but in the long run, the Jedi Order was long due a reset and a purge because they were going out of control and causing a lot of damage. Well guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification down below, and also check us out on Twitter. Thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.